bad that the Romans made their own law that no Roman citizen could die by crucifixion. No matter what crimes they committed, a Roman could not die from crucifixion. It was only used for foreigners and slaves. So that's what Jesus went through. That's a typical crucifixion for a victim, this physical amount of suffering. But see, Jesus, he went through the physical suffering, but he also went through this spiritual suffering. Paul writes it in 2 Corinthians this way. He says, "For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sins so that we could be made right with God through Christ." See, on this cross, Jesus, who knew no sin, no regret, no shame, no guilt, just knew innocence his entire life, died on the cross and carried the sins for us. The man who knew no sin became sin for our sake. So I want you guys to take a moment. I want you guys to think of the worst sin that you've ever committed, the worst thing that brings the most guilt, the most shame, the most regret. I want you to, the one that you wouldn't want anybody in this room to know what you have done, and I want you to share it to the person on your left. And if there's nobody in your left, you can just shout it to me. I'm just kidding. Please don't do that. We don't have enough time for you to share your sins. But I want you guys to think of that sin. Think of the sins that you've committed, maybe the 10 that you did this morning. Add it to all the sins in this room, and I'll put my 2 that I've ever done in my life. I'll put it in there. And put it with the sins of this world. Every murder, every theft, every genocide, every jealous, greed, and envy that's been committed. And all that Jesus carried on when he was at the cross. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering a few things. Why did Jesus do this? Like, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Why couldn't Jesus honestly do what we all do to undeserving people today and just say, I forgive you? Like, why couldn't it have been a verbal thing? Now, I know the Christian answer. I know what I was taught in church. I know, like, 2nd grade, the thing that I was supposed to say that was, somebody asked me, why did Jesus die? I would say, well, for everybody has sinned, in order for us to be justified and redeemed, Jesus had to become the propitiation by the shedding of his blood in order to show God's true righteousness. Isn't that what you guys learned? I'm just kidding, guys. I honestly memorized Romans before I got up here. But I know Jamie's teaching our children that right now, so by the end of the day, our children are going to be biblically sound. You chose the right church. I'm just kidding. But honestly, the answer that we do say, when somebody asks this question, we do say, well, because Jesus had to die for our sins. But have we ever stopped and asked the question, why? Because it seems like God put himself into a box. There's like questions that we want to ask that sometimes it feels like we'll never get the answer to. The first one is, what kind of God does this to a son? That's the first question that just runs through our mind. Second question is, why did it have to be Jesus? Why did Jesus have to do this himself? So why did God do this? Why did Jesus do this? And the third question that I feel like we'll never get the answer to is, if you watch the NFL, it is, what is a catch? If you guys want, no NFL fans here? To know what a catch is? Most debated thing in the world. But it seems like, can't God change the rules? Can't God change it? I mean, we change rules all the time when we're playing board games with somebody or make up our own rules. Why can't God, who created us, who we change rules, why can't he change the rules for his son? When we read Romans 3, where I got that quote that I got from, it's one of the most complicated chapters in all of Scripture, based upon that sentence I just said. But there's a part at the very end of it, verse 25 and 26, that I feel like gives us an answer. It says, "For God presented Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. God did this to demonstrate his righteousness, for he himself is fair and just, and he decides sinners to be right in his sight when they believe in Jesus." See, this is big, and this is something we can easily pass over. So why did Jesus have to die on the cross? It is because God is both fair and just. You see, God just doesn't dispense justice. He is justice. And when there is injustice around, when there is error, when there is sin, when there is fault, true just, his nature is to be just, means that eventually somebody's gonna have to pay. See, pure justice doesn't just let people off the hook. You and I can do that. You and I can let people off the hook. But when it comes down to it, if we want pure justice, we want something to get made right, we can't just let somebody off the hook. Somebody has to pay. But then that brings up the question, well, if God is just, then why is there so much injustice in this world? Why doesn't God come now and stop it? You can look around, you can turn on the news, and you see so much injustice. What kind of just God would do this? Would let this continue? Well, when you read the Bible in its context, you can also see he may be fair, he may be just, but God is also merciful and gracious, which means in God's mercy, he can let sin go on for a while, but his justice says eventually it's going to have to end. See, God says, in my mercy, I'm going to let it happen. In my justice, eventually somebody's going to have to pay. But in my grace, I will send my son. See, in my mercy, when you sin, you don't have to be smited right then and there. So that means, guys, when we're driving and somebody cuts us off and we let a little birdie fly, that we are not smited in that moment, which some of you might have been smited this morning. Anybody want to raise your hand? Please don't do that. You might just put a tracker right there on you. But in those moments, when you let the birdies fly or the language out, you're not punished right there because God's gracious. So in his mercy, you won't be, he's going to let it go for a while. It won't happen immediately. But in his justice, eventually somebody will have to pay. But in his grace, Jesus is the one that paid. See, the cross shows us God's love. It is a reminder of his mercy, his justice, and his grace. This is real love. That's what John says in his letter in 1 John. He says, this is real love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. So you see, when Jesus said, it is finished, what he was saying was his work on this earth is done. It is finished, it is complete, which means somebody finally paid. Somebody has now taken upon all the sins that this world has committed. See, what his work was done, what was finished, is we were made right with God, that we no longer have to question who we are in God's eye. Because in this time, in this first century world, who God was it was up for question. It was confusing. Nobody knew. Nobody knew if God was a wrathful God. Nobody knew if God was a gracious God. But Jesus came to reveal who God truly was. And that was a merciful, a justice, and a gracious God. So when it is finished, it means that we no longer have to question that we were made whole in God's eyes. So right now, I'm going to now tag Michelle back up here. But before I do want to say that my girl Beyonce totally deserved that award. So I'll let Michelle finish.
That remains to be seen now. All right. Can we thank Brian for all his hard work? I am so proud of that guy. I trust that our teenagers and young adults are in good hands with him. If you didn't catch the earlier announcement, next week, starting on Easter Sunday, we are having middle school services at both services, not just at the 10:30. So if you are a middle schooler or you have a middle schooler, please let them know. We've got fun stuff going on for them upstairs with Brian. Now, I want to continue kind of what Brian was sharing, because if you're anything like me, if you're a little skeptical like I am, I'm a little bit contrarian, I always have a lot of questions, then this whole idea about sin being such a big deal that someone had to die doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay? If I'm honest and I share with you, as I think about the question that Brian asked, what's the biggest sin that you might be the most ashamed of? comes immediately to mind. Several do. And if I think about everything I've done, all the ways I've cut corners, all the ways that I told little bitty lies to get my way a little better, a little easier, the ways that I've disappointed people, the ways that I've caused people not to trust me. If I think about all of those things together, and if you were to hand my record, let's say, over to a judge and put me in front of a judge in a court of law, I still don't think they would sentence me to death. Some people might want to kill me, but I don't think that by a court of law's standards, I would be sentenced to death. And so what does this mean, right? Or when does this begin? I think about my kids. I've got three daughters, 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 8-year-old. When does this begin for them? This accountability, this sin equals death equation. When does this start? It's pretty common on the weekends for us to let our girls make their own breakfast. Like I said, they're 4, 6, and 8. Think they got it covered. And a couple of mornings ago, I heard a sound that I'm not familiar with hearing when they're making their own breakfast, and that was the microwave. Well, that's exciting. What are they up to today? I thought. Got downstairs to see 19 minutes and 48 seconds left on the microwave. And I popped that bad boy open to find a red Solo cup with water and a metal spoon sitting inside. Somebody, some smart little angel of mine, had decided to put a plastic Solo cup with water and a metal spoon in the microwave and set that baby for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. What in the world? And so what do you think would have happened had we not caught it at that 12-second mark? What do you think would have happened? Yeah, a fire, right? Something's going to explode in my house. Maybe the whole kitchen comes undone. I don't know. I don't actually know what would have happened. And as I mentioned earlier, we rent our home. So I don't know what that would have done to our lease agreement, to say the least, right? I think about that, and I think, how in the world do I explain to Nora, my middle child, my wonderful middle, how do I explain to her how a microwave works and why that's a bad idea? In what kind of an age-appropriate way do I tell this child the damage she could have caused had we not swooped in when we did? Or let's say we had been out doing yard work and not even inside the house when she put it in the microwave in the first place. Let's say all the 20 minutes ran down and the microwave and kitchen did explode. Do I go to her for payment? Is she now responsible as a general contractor to redo the... No, how does this make any sense? It doesn't make any sense to her. This is what it's like for God to try to explain to us the consequences of our sin that we think is no big deal. We think it's no big deal. Here's the catch. Our inability to grasp God's holiness, his purity, his perfection, his glory, our inability to grasp really who he is what stops us from understanding how grave our sin is. Because we do this thing, we compare ourselves among ourselves, right? And I'm thinking about my sin and I'm looking at you guys, and I know some of you, so I'm feeling all right. Right? And you're probably thinking about the person to your left and going, yeah, I didn't do what they did. Right? And you know somebody who sins bigger than you. Of course you do. You know somebody who's done worse than you. And so do I. And so we do this thing. We compare ourselves among ourselves, but that's not what God does. When he looks at us, he looks at us in light of his Son, in light of his holiness, in light of his perfection, and we cannot compare. You cannot mix sin with holiness. And this is the thing that is impossible for us to understand in our little bitty brains. No matter how big we start to think, we cannot possibly comprehend the weight of our sin. It's too hard. And so God is looking at us and we're going, what's the big deal? It's a Solo cup with a spoon in the microwave. What's the problem? This is fine. And he's going, girl, how do I even begin with you? Where do I even start? And so instead he says, I'm going to do the best that I can. I'm going to do the best that I can to show you what this means. But I'm not going to ask you to pay. I'm not going to ask you to pay because even if I could, what you would pay would never be enough. You would not be able to cover it. So he says, you know what, I'll take it. I'm going to do my best to explain this to you, but I'm going to take the payment on myself. I'm going to cover you for this, just like we did with Nora. We cover her. It would be like explaining the quantum theory of energy to a 2-year-old. Where do you begin? You just don't, right? It just is. And so this is what it is with God. So with the cross, we have a picture. We have a symbol, his best attempt at showing us the weight of our sin. If you were listening to Brian go through the steps of crucifixion, I can't even muster the energy to understand one part of what he said, one piece of the pain, one piece of the humiliation. And God says, this is a picture for you. This is the cost of sin. The cross is a picture for us. It's an illustration. It's God's way of communicating to the world that sins can be forgiven once and for all. And that we don't have to be separated from God. And that's why the Apostle Paul writes this. He says, he canceled the record of the charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. That's what he did for us. And so he did his best to explain to us his great love, his great mercy, that while he is fair and just, he is full of love for us. And so if you go around your life trying to earn God's favor, you missed it. If you've been spending your life trying to check off the religious boxes and do all the right things, you've missed it. If you're still keeping secrets and feeling ashamed of the things that you have done or the things in your past, then you have utterly missed it. Because what Jesus did on the cross takes care of all of that. The message of the cross is summarized in the final words of Jesus. It is finished. It's done. There is no usefulness in carrying shame. There is no use in carrying guilt. We hand it to him and it is done. Now, I want you to pull out your connection card that I pointed out earlier. I want to show you something on that card if you have it handy. Maybe you're here and you're going, yeah, this is good. I needed this reminder, Michelle, because I've been following Jesus for a while and I kind of forget this crucifixion thing every now and then. And I'm glad. I want you to be encouraged. But if you're here and you're going, whoa, I don't know about this. And you would say to yourself, really, he would do that for me? Individually, he would do that for me? And I'm here to tell you, yes, he would, and he did. And this is why we're here today. And so there's a box on that connection card that says, I am making a first-time decision to follow Jesus. And if you would make that decision today, I just would encourage you to check that box. Not that checking the box does anything. There's nothing spiritual or transformational about checking that box. All that does is let us know that we have an opportunity to resource you. Because those of us that have been attempting to follow Jesus for any length of time, we know that it's a process. It's not a one and done. We're still figuring it out. We're still learning. And so what I would like to do, I would like to be able to get you some resources to get you off on the right foot. So if you would make that decision to follow Jesus today, I would just ask you to check that box, make sure that we have your correct email address and your correct address, and we'll get you some resources to help you along on this journey. And if you would say, Michelle, it's not my first time, it's like my 50th time checking that box, no problem. If you want the resources, check it anyway. You can feel free to make me a little note and say, it's actually my 5th time. Totally fine. Okay, all I want to do is I want to make sure that you have what you need to get off on the right foot. Okay, we want to equip you. We want to resource you. And now maybe you're here and you made that decision some time ago to follow Jesus, but you're trying to figure out what your next steps are today. And we always want to talk about, we're not going to just consume a good message. We want to do something about it. And so we have, just in a few weeks coming up, our baptism service. I want to see me get excited about something. I get excited about baptisms. It is one of my favorite things that we do around here. And so if baptism might be your next right step, go ahead and mark that on your connection card or write in the note there that you'd like information about baptism. We'll get you some more information about it. But let me just give you the gist. Baptism is not for people who have finally figured out this Jesus life. Baptism is not for people that are like, ooh, I got it all together. I'm obeying all those 10 commandments on a daily basis, and I got all the rules. No, this is not what baptism is. Baptism is simply a way for you to demonstrate what has already taken place inside your heart. That's all it is. So you guys see my wedding ring? Can you see it from where it's huge and blingy? I know you're all very impressed. So this wedding ring, taking it off, does this make me no longer married? My husband sure hopes not, right? This does not mean that I am no longer married. What this is an outward symbol of an inward commitment that I have made in my heart to my husband. This is an outward symbol, and putting it on is just that. It's a way for me to identify that I'm a Peterson, that we're married, I'm in this family, and that's what this is. And so it is with baptism. Baptism doesn't make you saved. It doesn't give you a relationship with Jesus. Baptism is an acknowledgement that you have a relationship with Jesus and you're taking your next step in faith to identify with him. And we'll explain more in the resources to come if you're interested. But I just want to encourage you, if you've yet to do that, to take that next step, I really would encourage you to find out more, and let's get you baptized in the next couple of weeks. It's an awesome celebration. One last thing I want to mention before we head out today is next week is Easter. You probably didn't need me to remind you about that, but if this is your first Easter season or spring season with Great Lakes Church, I just want to let you know what goes on. Because I know a lot of people feel like there's like the secret language, there's a secret code that happens around Easter time, and everybody knows the dress code and everybody knows what to do. So I'm going to give you guys the dress code. Are you ready? Wear something. Wear something. That is it. And the reason I say that is oftentimes, even for those of us that didn't grow up in church, you kind of think, oh yeah, but Easter is the day that you wear the shiny white shoes and the fancy dress, and people still carrying parasols. I don't know what's happening in other places. You wear your sport coat, all of that's what happens on Easter. And let me just tell you, if you wouldn't normally wear a sport coat and carry a parasol, please don't do that next week. Please don't do that. And here's why. People are going to come next week because somebody invited them. And hopefully people are going to come because you invited them. And when they come, they want to figure out, is this place for them or not? And when they come, they may be wearing a sport coat because their grandma told them that they had to. But what they are going to see when they walk in is they're going to see all of us in our jeans and our hoodies, because that's what we usually wear. And they're going to go, oh, so maybe next week I could come here just like as me, instead of in all these fancy clothes. Okay, so will you guys help me create that atmosphere where we can come as we are, where we can wear our baseball caps, and Brian can wear his beanie, and I can wear my jeans,